Thank you for joining me. I'm Nola Simon. I'm the host of the Hybrid Remote Center of Excellence. And today I want to talk about managing up is often frequently misunderstood. A lot of people really think that it can only be something that you do with your immediate manager and really focusing on their weaknesses. It's not actually true, I personally find. It's about how you actually work with them in a collaborative manner so that you can actually broaden what you're both capable of. It may be a weakness that you have and your manager has, but it's how you actually work together on it. So, for example, I had a manager, she had never actually worked from home, so she was managing a team of remote workers. We were working on a hybrid basis, actually. We started off at 1 day a week and then gradually got up to 4 days a week. And because she had never experienced it herself, I ended up managing up because I was the actual person who was doing the work. I could explain to her how perspective changed, how communications became difficult. One example was we would be having team meetings and they would have like a large conference room. It's actually set up like a university lecture room. So they would have people present at the front. And when the audience asked questions, we could hear the person at the front because they were on camera, they had a mic, but we couldn't hear the questions that the audience asked unless the speaker actually repeated themselves. So they needed to repeat the question and then answer the question. The instinct without training is to really just answer the question that's in the room. Now, that's challenging because it means that half your audience, and it honestly was about half that at that point, doesn't have any idea of the context of the answer. So it's a waste of time for those people and it impacts the experience that they have. So it took probably 2 to 3 years before that actually became ingrained. And honestly, I would alternate the days that I was actually in the office versus at home because I could advocate from different perspectives. A lot of times it was useful for me to actually be in the conference room and basically put my hand up and say, would you mind repeating the question for the people who are at home? And actually serving as an advocate in the audience. Eventually, she got to the point where she was that advocate. She was the leader in her management team, really, to say, this is what we need to consider. So it's not like I actually sat her down and said, this is what we need to be doing. I role modeled the behavior. And that can be done with your immediate manager, but can it also be done with a larger team? It's that curse of knowledge. So we had larger divisional meetings where we had executives who worked at a certain level, and they would have these meetings thinking that everybody who actually attended them would know who they were. So when work from home really first started, they would broadcast these meetings. It wasn't Team, it wasn't Zoom, it wasn't anything like that. And all we would have access to would be Slido to actually submit questions. And the question I would submit was, would you mind introducing yourself, who you are, what division you lead, what your job title is, so we could figure out, according to the org chart, who they actually were. Because knowing who they were informed their relationships, informed their understanding of the company and how they related to you on a daily basis. So it was really useful to be able to put the information that they were sharing in the context of who they were and where they fitted into the organization. That took probably about a year for the communications team to really influence it to the point where they could train the executives to get in the mindset of introducing themselves and not just assuming that everybody knew who they were, right? Little things like that can be considered managing up. It can also be larger than that. I tried to get into a leadership boot camp. Basically, it was like a make work project that the training team created to groom people for management and leadership roles. And I was declined because you weren't allowed to ask for help. You weren't allowed to ask for any kind of backup. I had little kids. I couldn't do all the extra hours that they were asking for because of the distance that I had to commute. And so I was never actually considered a candidate for that program. But because I shared on social media, because I was a go-to resource for leadership. I was often invited down to the US to speak. I was actually brought in to train that training group, even though they wouldn't even let me take the program, because I showcased how much I can manage up without even actually having to be trained. I did it myself. So that's an example as well, too. And then I started volunteering with change management teams. I started doing videos with the communications team to engage employees and showcase how different things worked around the organization. I volunteered with employee resource groups and then brought that training back to the team and the managers. At one point, I sent a note to my manager and I said, I noticed an issue when we're working with different organizations, like areas of the company, that there's really no connection. Like we've got major silos. And how do you break that down so that they're communicating properly? She encouraged me to send a note to the CEO at the time. And then I was invited by her direct report, who's an executive vice president, to actually present at the marketing meeting. So that's a version of managing up as well, too. So I needed her support to feel confident enough to approach the CEO, but it was a project that she was willing to put her name to and support me if anybody came back to her and complained that I had approached the CEO, for example. So it's how can you collaboratively work together to really enforce change that's happening within the organization? And I did this at multiple different jobs. One of the managers that I had maybe 20 odd years ago, I came in and RESPs, Registered Education Savings Plans, were just new at the time. And I had done a deep dive into them because I, was looking at having kids. I was interested in what was available. And so I really became a subject matter expert on registered education plans. And then I changed companies and I had this new manager. So I ended up teaching him all about registered education savings plan. And when our jobs were restructured because the company was sold, he actually got a job working directly in registered education savings plans. And that's a 20-year career. It's really how you can influence the thinking. And it's fascinating to see how far you can actually take that, because I influenced the thinking so much that one time I had just changed jobs. Maybe it was about 6 months into that job, and I ended up doing an employee resource group meeting. And the CEO of the bank deferred to me because I knew the bank better than he did, although he was the technical leader of the bank. At 6 months tenure, I knew better than he did, and he trusted me to be able to speak on his behalf. That's managing up. How can you do that at an industry level? So this week, for example, just even on LinkedIn, I've influenced the thinking of a researcher into hybrid remote who works at a university in the US. He actually rejigged his project that he's working on to incorporate my thoughts. I challenged the thinking of an adjunct professor who works in BC, who's on the Thinkers 50 radar. And you could literally see him change his position based on a podcast episode that I did. It's fascinating. And those are only the ones that I pick up on, how you can actually influence it. And this is where it's really important to share your perspectives and your skills and abilities, because we're moving into an era in work where skills are really going to matter. And it's the rare organization that's going to teach you everything that you want to do, because it's going to be limited to the business. In my experience in the past, it took me a really long time to get any kind of leadership training because I wasn't directly a people manager. And they didn't seem to understand the point that if they gave me the training, I'd be better prepared to become a people manager. It was almost like you had to do it and then they might train you. It was really odd. Anyways, the training that I managed to talk them into was influence and persuasion. And that is directly related to managing up. And that has been incredibly useful for consulting, for speaking, for building the business, for becoming a LinkedIn top voice. It's all training and skill development. And so going forward, how you collaborate with people, not who only directly manage you, but with their boss and executive leadership, industry leadership, even government, because a lot of things are changing and eventually some things are going to have to be legislated. So you need to be able to influence all of these things. And how you do that and how you build the skills that you need to be able to do that type of work, that is going to be critical. A lot of it you might actually have to take the initiative to do yourself. Once I stopped campaigning for the company to actually fund my training and started investing and doing it myself, I hired my own coaches. I started taking courses on Coursera. I took different university courses. Once I invested in my own skill development, that's where I was really able to start connecting the dots and really elevate my thinking. And I didn't wait for it. And mentoring is going to look different. I've never had a direct mentor. I campaigned so hard for mentorship and sponsorship. At one point, the global CEO, the head of HR, actually not the global CEO, sent me a note through the head of the employee resource groups to basically back down that they weren't going to do any kind of official mentorship or sponsorship program. And so I'm fascinated with the fact that there's a real shift towards this type of learning and development investment, the upskilling, all of the concern about what AI is going to do to work and how we're really going to need support to support employees to really update and amend their skills. I'm fascinated with how that's going to actually translate into mentorship and sponsorship. And that works all ways because we've got 5 different generations in the workforce. How can we learn from each other? And what does that look like when we share? Because it's not just that it's older people mentoring newer people coming in. What can we learn from the newer people? How do we unlearn mindsets that aren't helpful any longer? How do we unlearn skills that are holding us back? How do we reskill? And how do we put that all together so that we're building a future of work that we all want? And that's where I think that if you only think about managing up as dealing with your immediate manager and dealing with the transactional day-to-day work, you're missing the larger strategic possibilities of going beyond your job description and really making change in the world. I'll give you another example. I had a VP who supervised my supervisor, and he had created a sales script. That sales script included the first Prime Minister of Canada, who's deeply involved in the railroad and systematic racism. If you've seen red paint reports about statues around Canada, you know who I'm talking about. He was the first president of the company, and he was embedded in that sales script. And I didn't think that was politically a great thing to include. So I had that changed. I worked with our employee resource group that was responsible for Indigenous information. And she was already working on it, of course, because she was deeply aware of the impacts of that story as well. And I embedded it into my performance review. I actively campaigned against it. I refused to say the line that included the Prime Minister. And eventually it was changed and omitted. I'm not sure. I think it got removed from the onboarding as well, too, as far as I remember, the ERG information. So that's another way of managing up. It's like what worked for years and years may not be politically appropriate. And it probably never was, but it was allowed and accepted. And can you continue to work like that? And it was delicate because he had built his career based on that script. That was how he was important to the company, he felt. And it was interesting because once that actually changed, his role, I'm not sure exactly how that all fell out, but he wasn't there any longer. Again, that's another aspect of managing up. Standing up for what you feel is right and espousing the values that you feel that you need to do to make sure that the change that you want to see in the world is happening. Hopefully, all these stories are helpful to make you think about managing up in a different way. Maybe we can apply it to diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, equal pay. We could apply it to more diversity in senior leadership. And that's really where the changes can happen to enliven the world of work and make it more collaborative, more innovative, and more supportive. And that's my hope. That's my hope. So don't feel that because you're on the front line or you're further down the hierarchy that you can't make change. You definitely can. It's all in the mindset and how you actually approach it and feel safe doing so. And what do you need to feel safe? That's the question. So, anyways, hopefully that's helpful. And I'd love to hear your thoughts and any questions you might have. And, feel free to rate, review, or comment. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.